Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Avatar discussion topic. This one's going to be about, is Aang a bad father, based on how he is presented in the Legend of Korra episodes Civil Wars Part 1 and Civil Wars Part 2, K203 and K204. Immediately the answer is no. It is one of the most hyperbolic statements that a lot of the fandom tends to put out there about Legend of Korra, is interpreting these episodes as they present Aang as being a bad father. No, these episodes present Aang as being a father who wasn't perfect, which is a very different thing than being presented as a bad father. And I don't know if this is just the people who feel this way, just I think saying the wrong thing, just using the wrong wording to present how they feel about it. But to me, saying Aang's a bad father is sort of putting him in the same category as like Ozai, as Yakone, actual characters who are these terrible people to their children. Aang is nothing like that based on what is presented in these episodes. And to put him in that sort of similar category, in the bad father category, based on this episode, is just what an interpretation that is, in my mind. That just presenting Aang, like Toph is presented in Korra, as being a parent who isn't perfect. And even then, I'd actually would say that they go further with Toph into presenting her issues with her kids as being a bigger issue than Aang and his family. This is just like for the relationship, which otherwise seems like borderline perfect. It's just, here are the flaws of, in a way, that dynamic. That Aang is, he and Zuko helped create Republic City with the help of everyone, of course. So that's in play. He is the Avatar, so he's important in the world, full stop. At the time when sort of media is also coming quite heavily into play, so there must have been a ton of pressure on them as a family, being this real celebrity couple, I suppose, as Republic City comes into the spotlight, and that there's also the pressure on both of them in a way to have kids, and have kids who are, one of them at least is an airbender. So as is pointed out in Avatar Legacy, in sort of Katara's letter to Tenzin, this was a big thing for them, both of them, when Tenzin was born and was an airbender. And then you came along and everything changed, and not just in the way things change for every parent when a child is born. When we discovered that you too were an airbender, and that the airbenders would not die out with the passing of your father, we were filled with joy. A terrible burden was lifted from your father's shoulders, which only added to our happiness in welcoming you to our family. So, you have to have that point of view in it as well, of like, yes, it does make sense to a degree why Aang would focus quite heavily on Tenzin, because in Tenzin also lies the hope of an entire nation. That, Kaya and Bumi, of course, kind of joke at Tenzin's expense that, he sort of feels that way about himself. But it is true. The whole series, being called Avatar: The Last Airbender, is an important title because of what happened. That the Air Nomad genocide did basically wipe out an entire culture, except for Aang. And Tenzin being born is an important thing for the world, and of course he's going to do everything he can to continue that culture. But also, Aang is not the sort of character who wants to just, sort of just put his culture on everyone else. And I think you could see that even in ATLA. He doesn't go overboard with, even in the comics, for instance, with trying to overly incorporate, say, Katara into his culture or anything like that, to the point where even Katara sort of notes that, she almost feels bad for maybe not showing as much interest as she probably should in Aang's culture, given what happened to him. Now, that doesn't obviously excuse the, as it's presented, idea that he brings Tenzin on all of these vacations just one-on-one. But obviously the full story isn't presented, in that, a handful of vacations that Bumi and Kaya remember not going on obviously overshadows all of the other fun and happy times. Which is why, basically at the end of Civil Wars, are Kaya, Bumi, and Tenzin at odds with each other? Are they all lingering on how bad of a father Aang was? No. That things weren't perfect, which is sort of the dynamic that they're going for there. That Kaya and Bumi are sort of upset that Tenzin has this view of Aang, that he was this perfect father. And they're just trying to make it clear to him that, no, like, it was good, but he wasn't perfect. Like, we did have our struggles because Aang was the Avatar and everything going on and so on. But in the end, they focus on stuff like this. This family portrait is more representative of their time as a family than the disappointing times when Aang went off with Tenzin on his own. In the same way that there must have been times before Tenzin was born, when Kaya, as a waterbender, got one-on-one training with Katara, and Bumi, as a non-bender, couldn't have been involved. That there's these dynamics that happen in families. And it's actually Iki in the episode who is the one to, with Tenzin as they talk, because again, Iki, in the episode, Iki runs off because of an issue she has with Jinora and Milo. And then Tenzin sort of ends up separating from his own siblings to find her. And so they both basically have a one-on-one talk where what ends up happening is that Iki wants Kaya and Bumi there because she notes the positives of her uncle and aunt. Tenzin would like Milo and Jinora to be there with them, and he notes the positive traits of his other children. And the problem is that because Tenzin's feuding with his own siblings and because Iki's feuding with her own siblings, they both sort of disagree with the positive that each other presents. And so they both have this sort of reflection time where they accept basically the struggles of being part of a family. And I think that's such an interesting kind of takeaway from all of this. Let me just find it here. This is it. I could get used to it here. No one's yelling at me or telling me I'm delusional. Iki says, we should have Uncle Bumi and Aunt Kaya come visit. I bet they'd like it too. Let's not. They'd only spoil our good mood. What do you mean? Aunt Kaya is super nice and pretty and always asks me how I'm feeling, and Uncle Bumi is like the funniest person in the world. Tenzin says, well, what about Milo? He's hilarious too. You never know what's going to come out of his mouth. And Jinora can be so sweet and gentle. And then Iki pops in and says, and mean and bossy. And then she just stops for a second and realizes, being part of a family is hard, huh, Daddy? I couldn't agree with you more, is Tenzin's response. But Iki continues and says, I guess the nice part about a family is that they'll always be there for you, even though, and then we cut to some of the Sky Bison calves fighting. Twinkle Star Child and Princess Rainbow fight, but they still love each other, and Tenzin just notes that that's very wise of you, Iki. And he makes the decision, let's go back. And then when they go back, what happens? Immediately, Iki, Jinora, and Milo just immediately make up. This issue that made Iki run away while they're on vacation, they resolve like that. Because it's just this relatively petty squabble, a typical thing that happens among family members. Because you're so close, little issues can be big and can seem like the worst thing in the world, but you can resolve them like that. Probably the best example in Korra of this is Mako and Bolin, when they're sort of at odds with each other with the romance stuff in book 1, even the issue over, like, is Mako right about Varric, and he is, and everyone has to sort of apologize to Mako. Mako and Bolin just make up over really serious things like, we good? We good. Yeah. Like, it's so simple because that's the dynamic here. And in the end, that's basically the dynamic that they go for with Kaya, Bumi, and Tenzin, is that the issues that they bring up, yes, were an issue at the time, but all this time, later, like what, 30-something years later, they're finally addressing it, I suppose, here. Yes, they can all acknowledge that, okay, it wasn't perfect, but it wasn't bad either, that they're there for each other, that fundamentally they may have times when they don't get along, but Kaya, Bumi, and Tenzin do all care about each other. They all care about their mother, they all cared about Aang, Aang cared about them. Where does this whole idea that, like, Aang is a bad father come into play? It all seems very, like, realistically done. And again, what's not helped is, of course, is that, like, this is, like, the only real time that they sort of reflect on Aang as a parent in the show. And I don't think that's a criticism of Korra necessarily. I think it's more a criticism of just, like, the franchise full stop. And it's, like, unwillingness to really show us the characters when they're older, outside of, like, a couple of pieces of art in books like this. And that's where the issue is, that we don't get to see a lot of the happier times necessarily. But the idea is that there was a lot of those happier times. Let's bring up the Kaya scene from Turf Wars Part 1. So, it's even addressed actually in the episode, like, because it's not just sort of about Aang and Tenzin. They also kind of go at each other over this. Like, they talk about sort of Bumi, despite being the oldest sibling, is the most immature in a way. And Tenzin's like, and that's why I had to become the responsible one. And Kaya's like, really, it's you? And then, Tenzin fires back at her. That, like, you think you were, but you're the one who went sort of like gallivanting around the world trying to find yourself and were, like, gone for a long time. That they all get really harsh with each other about their, like, specific traits and so on. But in the end, they all turned out really well. Like, Kaya is a respected healer in the world, and she's done her own traveling, sort of in a way like a nomad herself, almost, to a degree. Bumi, despite being a non-bender, was able to, have an effect on the world, because he got up to a very high position in the United Forces. Like, the fact that he joined that, he chose to join that to have an effect, despite being a non-bender, and got to the rank of commander and is respected by people like Iroh. That speaks very highly of him. And then Tenzin, of course, is fully set on, he wants to be, he cares about being the leader of the Air Nation going forward. And with his own family, and then especially, like, in Book 3, when we see his reaction to so many other air nomads coming into the world, it's an emotional thing for him. And he does reflect that, like, he really wishes Aang was here to see this, because, in a way, like, that Tenzin's emotional response to seeing other airbenders, like, imagine how that feels for Aang, and the one other airbender is his son. That's a huge thing for him. But anyway, the Kai scene from Turf Wars. So, of course, this is a lot about Korra and Asami's relationship, and of course Kaya, we know, is LGBT as well, and this is where she kind of says, like, you two make a beautiful couple, and they hadn't told anyone really at this point, so it's kind of telling that Kaya is the one to sort of notice this. And she just notes, I remember the first getaway I had with my first girlfriend. I'd never been so happy. And she just goes through a lot of it, the cultures and so on. But Korra asks Kaya, how did Aang react when you told him? And Kaya's response is just that he was nothing but supportive. Remember, my father grew up in the air temples, where men and women didn't hide who they loved. The air nomads were accepting of differences and embraced everyone, no matter their orientation. So there you go. Kaya is probably the harshest on Aang in Civil Wars towards Aang. But the fact that she's willing to actually, come to him to talk about her sexuality to Aang, and she notes that coming out of it, that he was nothing but supportive. That's a big thing. That if she had a proper issue with Aang, if she really took those vacations that he went on with Tenzin, like, so badly that she disliked him, would she ever have come out like that and been so open with him specifically? I don't think so. And I think it seems like this. separate than the Civil War stuff, that really helps to point out that Aang isn't a bad father. They still care about him. In the middle of this sort of civil wars, civil as in like sort of family, wars between family. That's what the episode title is more referring to than the civil war between North and South that's happening in Book 2 at this time. That's one of the themes of Book 2 Spirits, is family. It's a book where you have Unalaq and Tonraq against each other. You have Korra against her uncle. You have Mako and Bolin sort of at odds with each other also. And, pretty notably, you have within these episodes the issue between Iki and her siblings, as well as the issue between Tenzin and his siblings. And family dynamics come up quite heavily. So, yeah, they bring up a lot of these points, and issues come out. Issues are made bigger deals of. But, you know, again, what does it say ultimately? That they're really at odds with each other to the point where they sort of run off away from each other. And something as simple as just them together looking at a picture from the past of the happy family and them literally acknowledging to each other, we were a happy family, we are a happy family. That's telling. And then going forward, is there really any issue between the siblings? No. Bumi has a bit of an arc in that going into Book 3, he becomes an airbender and is able to later in life have this even sort of deeper connection to his father that he never felt like he would have. And the fact that like it's his brother who's the one who sort of gets to like train him, and then Bumi gets to really help sort of really train the new air nomads as well. It's this kind of extra layer onto things of like, that's a nice extra bit of arc for Bumi to have this thing. He's the oldest, the eldest, and he gets this opportunity. I think that works, you know, really well. And again, Tenzin has to go on this arc. What he goes through in Book 2, realizing he is Tenzin. He's not Aang. He doesn't have to be just the second coming of Aang. He has to be himself. That's the key. And then, you know, he doesn't handle sort of being the leader of this many new air nomads particularly well. And he needs the help of the likes of Jinora and everyone else to do that. That Tenzin has to realize so many of his own flaws within Book 2. Whether that be him being overly protective of, say, Jinora, when Jinora is getting close to becoming a master herself, which happens in Book 3. But he has to acknowledge that she is the one to spiritually have to be Korra's guide. It can't be him because he's not spiritual enough. Similarly with Bumi, there's the scene when Tenzin goes off and Bumi goes to the Hall of Avatar statues and talks to the Aang statue. And he just wants Aang to be proud of him, and he feels that because he was a non-bender that wasn't there. But who is the one to give him the confidence? Who is the one to say he would be proud of you? It's Kaya. And again, it's the fact that the two characters can say that about their own father, even though they've just been sort of criticizing him not that long ago in the episode. It tells you that, like, no, you are not meant to interpret this episode as Aang is a bad father, just that he wasn't perfect. And there's a vast gulf in difference between he's a bad father and he wasn't perfect. And for anyone who wanted the character to be presented as being perfect, that's unrealistic. That's not good writing. You have to have your characters be flawed so you care about them. That's why we cared about Aang in ATLA, the reluctant avatar. That you don't blame Aang necessarily for what happened, because we saw what was happening to him at the time. How could he have known? He wasn't told the full details that, like, we suspect there's an attack from the Fire Nation coming. If he had been told that, would he have run away like he did? I don't think so. So, you know, there's a lot of situations that come into play in terms of, like, you know, the air nomads didn't handle Gyatso and Aang's relationship well at that time, but Aang still ran away, and it becomes this thing that he blames himself for. And he makes mistakes over the course of the series, as we see in, like, Battle of the Water Tribe, into the Deserter. But all the characters do. They all have their own flaws. Katara can at times let herself be controlled by her emotions, and We saw what nearly happened in something like the Southern Raiders. Similarly, like, you know, I suppose with Paku to a degree, like, she nearly let her emotions kind of mess up a lot of what they were going for there. But in the end, that flaw, the fact that that can happen to Katara, is an aspect of her character that's important. The same with Zuko and his like decision making. It's always going to be the flaw that that character deals with. But we respect the character for that, that he's able to come back from those mistakes, making the wrong decisions. And once he can, in general, overall make the good decisions, we don't have a problem with that. It's always going to be a struggle for him. The same with Aang's main flaw, and that being his attachment. We saw that directly in episode 3, that one of his big attachments was, of course, to his people. And finding out that they were all gone was a huge blow to him. And when he saw Gyatso's skeleton, of course, he lost it. And the Avatar state, as like a character kind of mechanism, serves that role of like, for a character who has that attachment to people, the Avatar state is like a visual representation of that, more than just showing the character feeling emotional. So yeah, I think that's most of what I wanted to talk about in this one. I just get tired of seeing this very, I think, lazy criticism come up of like, wait, how do you interpret that scene as being that way? Like, that he's a bad father? I don't get it, like, at all, how that's what people take away from this in the end. That, like, there's no nuance to that whatsoever. When everything else highlights that, no, it's just that he's not perfect, and that's real. And that's what we want. We want realistic characters. And that's what we get. That... would it be that fun if all they ever talked about was just like, oh, things were so happy, you know, growing up and so on, when, like, part of why we care so much about Zuko is that he has sort of a tragic backstory that relates to his family dynamic. Aang's dynamic as well, and the fact that even as an air nomad, like, he doesn't know who his parents are. But Gyatso was the father figure to him, and the air nomads were already trying to sort of separate Gyatso from him. It speaks to, you know, the character defining moments. So why can't we do that for the Korra characters, that they have their issues as well? And it's the same thing with like Naruto and Boruto. Like, some people go really crazy about the fact that like Naruto isn't this like perfect father figure to Boruto, and that there's issues. But again, it's the idea that when you have a father figure who is that famous within the world, has such an important role, they're going to be busy. And these things happen, and it's realistic, and it creates the dynamic for your new characters. Otherwise, you just have to characterize them based off like, oh yeah, they had everything there. They had perfect childhoods growing up, so let's just bring something into play now. When the characters in the first place benefited from their tragic upbringing, in like Naruto's case, like not knowing his parents, and in Aang's case, being an air nomad, of course, and accepting what happened to his people, given that he was trapped in ice for so long. I don't know. I think it's just forever going to be one of those things with some of those opinions on Korra that I'll just never, ever see eye to eye with the people who honestly feel that that is the case. People who truly feel that those episodes present Aang as being a bad father, and they think Aang is a bad father because of it. About the only opinion on Korra that gets me more frustrated are people who think that Beginnings contradicts like Avatar's lore, and who don't get why it coincides like perfectly with it. That's probably more upsetting because it just shows a severe lack of understanding. But here it's just like, if you interpret that way, why should I have any confidence in how you interpret like other scenes? Just because it's like, whoa, like that's quite the takeaway from that scene that we just saw there. But yeah, I'll just end once again with this. this in the episode was used to basically highlight he's not a bad father, of course. Unless you're going to somehow interpret it as just like, you know, he threatened them to smile in the picture or something like that. There's probably people out there who feel that way, because there are some wild opinions out there, especially from people who don't like Aang as a character. But I do like Aang as a character, and I think I can appreciate that. Like, Aang is pretty much like my favorite character in Avatar, and I don't have an issue with how those episodes presented him. That to me is a realistic approach to a character who has so much going on and has a family. That it's overall good, but there were issues. That's fine. What's the problem with that? But yeah, they're my thoughts on this. In the comments, let me know what your thoughts were. But that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.